Hello and welcome back to the Walking Dead Retrospective, where today we'll be continuing our look back at the prison arc and starting to talk about the introduction of the first major villain of the series, that being the infamous Governor. But we've got a ton to talk about, so without further ado, let us dive in. If you recall, we already talked about the information asymmetry that was in place between the two versions. That is to say, in the comics, the introduction of the Governor was basically out of the blue. There were no hints, teasers, or anything else of that nature. So, by default, people's expectations were very different from the live-action adaptation, where we had both the source material as well as plenty of pre-season information that clearly showed us the character. And as such, I think one aspect that the show massively missed out on, which we will get into, is the absolute shock of his introduction. But with that in mind, let us get into the events themselves. First and foremost, you will have noticed that in the first video covering Season 3, I jumped over the episode where the Governor is actually introduced. And that was to purposely illustrate how different the approach was in the source material, because so far, just like the characters in the universe, we knew nothing about any other group out there. In the live-action version, however, right on the heels of the very first few episodes, we get a focus group following Andrea and Michonne, through which we are introduced to both the Governor and Woodbury as a whole. Just like in the book, they spot a helicopter going down and decide to follow it. The big difference here is that in the TV version, that is the duo of Andrea and Michonne, who again have not made contact with Rick, while in the book it's Michonne, Rick, and Glenn. And just before we continue on this plot thread, there are a few events back at the prison which will be important later on. Firstly, after the death of Alan, Andrea and Dale adopt Billy and Ben. From now on, think of them as Mika and Lizzie from later in Season 4. And the other major thing is that Carol isn't really doing great after everything that she's been through, and because she feels very alone, but so close to Lori and Rick, asks if she can marry the both of them. I know, if you haven't read the book, yeah, this probably seems a little random, but I promise it makes sense, so just keep that in mind. Lori is very taken aback and doesn't even know how to respond, but in essence says no, and that is simply not possible. Returning to the adaption, Andrea and Michonne make it to the crash site, where they run into the Governor's group. And here, we'll have to return to the trailer to address something that I avoided talking about last time. The fact that Merle's return was already shown in the trailer. We'll talk about the importance of how the series will handle its trailers later in the run, but keeping in mind that Merle is a TV show exclusive character, I really don't get why his return had to be basically spoiled before the season even began. But alright, I guess that's not that big of a deal. Andrea and Michonne are captured and taken to Woodbury. In the books, the trio find the helicopter, but it is already completely empty, but has a ton of footprints around, leading Rick to believe that someone lives closer to this place than they do. And as such, they begin to follow the prints to meet these people. And it's here, and I will say this quite a few times again, the two versions diverge a lot, so do try to bear with me here. In the live-action version, Andrea and Michonne are treated extremely well and are invited to stay in the town. Thing is, Michonne picks up on some fishy business going on and believes that this whole nice governor persona is a facade. In the book, on the other hand, the trio continue to stumble through the night until they are suddenly overwhelmed by floodlights and machine gun fire. They are quickly pulled through the gates where we meet Martinez and the big man himself, the Governor. Yes, if you haven't read the source material, it probably seems crazy, but indeed, Rick along with Glenn and Michonne are the first ever members of the survivors to meet the Governor. They are led through the town where he shows them the fighting pits and talks about how they feed the walkers, after which Rick asks them, what do they feed them? The Governor simply responds, well, stranger, we feed them strangers. I think it's clear why the introduction of the Governor was such a big deal. The leader of the group, the main character being at the complete mercy of this villain was an absolutely terrifying concept that we sadly didn't really get in the adaptation. And by the way, they did try to pull some trickery in the trailer to make you think that Rick will talk to the governor a lot earlier in the season. Keep this in mind for later parts in the series. But instead, his portrayal in the live-action version is more so of a mastermind with a dark side. And in a way, as much as I like the brutal pirate version of the books, I think the live-actions version does make a lot more sense. You don't get a formidable group by feeding everyone you meet to walkers, right? So instead, the dark side of the governor is shown to us as he fakes a surrender to the army, who are then quickly shot down by his men hiding in the woods. And frankly, this instance is still one of my favorites in the franchise. It does an incredible job, especially if you weren't familiar with the source material, of bonking you over the head with the idea that quote-unquote good people didn't really exist anymore, and showing you that Woodbury is pretty much a facade. The live-action version of the governor is basically only interested in remaining as the leader, something that a large influx of actual soldiers may put in jeopardy, and as such, he took calculated action. And in case you weren't convinced that he is a bad guy just yet, the show also gives you the infamous head water tank collection, just to hammer home that he may appear as a charming dude, but he is still extremely ruthless. Maybe not as much as in the book, but still. From a narrative standpoint, introducing the bad guy in this sort of focus episode format is how many shows handle it, and since both the trailer as well as the source material had obviously revealed the governor already, I'm not sure how well the shocking approach of introducing his character would have worked. I think it's just a case of differences in mediums, as well as in this particular case, information asymmetry. So even if I would have loved to see Rick being the one to meet him, this sort of approach also worked fairly well considering what's about to happen. And final note here, if you remember what we talked about in Season 2 with Andrea and Shane, with her arrival at Woodbury in relationship with the governor, her character is basically nothing like her comic book counterparts, and as such, whenever I talk about Andrea in the book, just think of them as sharing a name and nothing else. Returning to the book, at this point, the group is held up at gunpoint with basically no escape. And it's here where we get one of the biggest and probably well-known differences take place. The governor just chops off Rick's hand. Yup, it's done just like that. The second issue he is ever a part of, he cements himself as a very bad dude. Rick obviously passes out, but Michonne tries attacking them, and even manages to bite off the governor's ear. Though this proves to have been a very bad idea, since they are clearly far outmatched. Now, the old Kirk man is quite trigger happy with his characters, but not that much has to kill the main character here. We see Rick wake up and realize that he has indeed lost his hands. And we have to take a bit of a break from the story and have a meta discussion, as Kirkman's opinion on this event has changed somewhat throughout the years. In terms of practicalities, as much as I think everyone would have loved to see this moment adapted, it simply does not work for the show. The cost associated with always having to CG the hands of the main character of a show are just simply too high. On top of that, when reading a book, your suspension of disbelief is quite a bit more pronounced than when watching a show. So you see Rick do a bunch of things like climbing fences, etc, which would be far more difficult if it were to be done realistically. So it just limits the practical capabilities of the character. Kirkman's opinion on this has also changed in this sense. In 2011, Kirkman said that Rick's hand shouldn't be taken off in the adaption, stating that these practical limitations are what he has run into when writing the book already. He comes up with something cool, but Rick simply cannot do it with a single hand, that in most cases is already occupied by a gun. More recently, however, Kirkman has said that he did always want Rick to lose his hand, so it seems like Kirkman too isn't too sure about which version turned out for the best. After Rick wakes up, we get an interesting parallel between the governor and Rick himself, as he is told that the governor naturally and quickly emerged as the leader, just like Rick himself. And considering the events of the prison, where Rick had already gotten progressively more and more detached, It almost works like a what-if scenario where Rick would have somehow ended up as this cold-blooded, ruthless leader, such as the governor. As for the adaption, things are quite a bit different. Rick is dealing with the death of Lori, which sends him down a spiral of emotions, leading the group to basically be without a leader for a while. In essence, almost everything that happens at the prison for this period of time is exclusive to the adaption. And quick note, since I've seen some confusion about this, the people who Rick talks to on the phone are indeed ones we know. You can pick out Jim and Amy from back in season 1, as well as Lori. Also, there is a deleted scene where Rick finally catches up with Lori in the white dress, only for her to turn into a walker right in front of him. Just a random fun fact for you. Meanwhile in Woodbury, Michonne gets her stuff back and leaves the town. But since we are talking about the governor here, Merle along with a few other guys is sent after her. She takes out all of them aside from Merle. The duo trade blows and are both injured, though Merle continues to follow her until he runs into Glenn and Maggie, who are out on a supply run for baby formula and other supplies. Again, none of this happens in the book. They are both captured and taken to Woodbury, so at this point in both versions, Glenn is the only common factor of being held prisoner at Woodbury. Michonne, on the other hand, traces their steps back to the prison, where she is saved by the survivors and has her wounds treated. Their initial exchange is a little more heated than it was in the source material, but broadly speaking, she does feel much better about the prison than about Woodbury. We also find out that Daryl found Carol in the tombs, which had been a plot thread hanging on since Killer Within. Michonne then briefs everyone on Woodbury and how the two of them have been taken prisoner there. So with that, the squad assembles a force to liberate Glenn and Maggie. This is of course a major difference between the two. In the books, there is no assault on Woodbury at all, and no one would ever come to save any of them. Speaking of which, let us pick up the book, where Rick is still being treated for his hands, but Glenn and Michonne are being held prisoner. Now, here we have a part that I can't really show or even talk about, but just so you get an idea, the governor has a dungeon. A, kinda dungeon. And Michonne is taken there. Yes, it is that bad. In the adaption, on the other hand, Glenn is interrogated by Merle and then has to fight off a walker, also very much demonstrating the difference between two versions. I've kinda talked about this in previous parts already, but the comic book version of Glenn never really seemed anywhere near as developed in terms of both personality as well as capabilities in the apocalypse. Conversely, in the adaption, he never breaks, and it's Maggie that tells them about the prison. Returning to the book, as yet another form of punishment, Michonne is forced to fight in the pit, where she goes against what the governor told her and is once again put in the dungeon. Again, yes, it is that bad. Suddenly, however, Martinez runs into the doctor's office and tells Rick that he needs to come with him and that they are breaking out. He basically explains that he didn't think the governor would go as far as he did and he wants to save them. And quick notes, from the initial reading of the comic books, he does indeed seem like a good guy here. Taking a quick departure from Woodbury, it's here where Tyrese is finally introduced to the live-action version. I think it's clear to say from how much time has passed in the comics with him around already and his interactions with the group, that it will obviously be vastly different. Meanwhile, the survivors led by Rick begin their assault on Woodbury. And once again, we'll have to take a step back from the story for a moment and have a bit of a meta discussion of what this point signifies. This is what I view as the first real mid-season finale of The Walking Dead. That is to say, it's action-packed, with incredibly important story moments and a mandatory cliffhanger, which will have you coming back in February. Depending on who you ask, this is either the start of what ruined the show, or one of the most hype weeks of the year. Because I know opinion is very split on this, I'll just preface this entire thing by, please keep it civil. But I found myself flipping between these two camps. It's no secret that the rest of the series basically follows the 1-8-9-16 formula. Or in other words, important moments only happen in premieres, mid-season finales, mid-season premieres, and season finales. But on the other hand, I think the payoff moments that some of these episodes have could have never happened if it wasn't for this sort of approach. By definition, the payoff has to be cooked up, right? I still remember when this episode originally aired. Where I live, I could only watch the episodes on Mondays, so I had to spend the entire day off the internet to avoid spoilers. And bit of a personal fact, I guess, I used to swim competitively and we had practice on Mondays. And I just remember swimming laps while thinking, oh my god, what could have happened? I cannot wait to get home and watch it. And could that experience have been the same if it wasn't for the gigantic cooked up mid-season finales? Killer Within would say yes, but is that the exception to the rule, or? I'm not sure. And because I am so undecided on how I feel about the whole 18916 thing, I'll pass the question on to you. How do you feel about the importance of these few episodes in the season? Good or bad, and most importantly, why? I'd love to hear your takes on this. Alright, back to the story. The survivors have a good old shootout with the forces of Woodbury and free both Glenn and Maggie. Michonne, on the other hand, is nowhere to be seen. That is because she goes to take out the governor for sending Merle and the other dudes after her. In the books, however, with the help of Martinez, they free Glenn and Michonne and are ready to escape. But Dr. Stevens and Alice decide to tag along with them. Similar to the adaption, Michonne stays behind and goes after the governor. Though remember that in the book, he didn't try to kill her like he did in the adaption. He did something that is arguably much worse. And as such, what happens in his apartment simply cannot be on YouTube. But to give you an idea in case you have not read it, she uses a spoon multiple times in multiple places, the same spoon. She uses a drill multiple times in multiple places. And just like he did to Rick, she chops off his hands and a bunch of other things that are just a big ol' yikes. But the thing is, she leaves him alive. In the adaption, there's an actual fight that breaks out between them, and he does of course lose the eye. Compared to the books though, that is a very small sacrifice. Still talking about the adaption, after the successful rescue mission, the group escapes pretty much straight away, only to realize that Daryl has been captured and is forced to fight his brother, who everyone thought was dead. Another assault ensues, and Daryl along with Merle are saved, and everyone including Michonne are on their way back to the prison. In the book, while escaping, Dr. Stevens is bitten, and the rest of the group are forced to run off anticipating that they get caught otherwise. A short while later, Michonne manages to catch up with them, and the group, now with Martinez and Alice joining them, head back for the prison. And following this point, the stories diverge massively again, so we will be jumping between the two and just talking about the major events. Though in the book, before we return to the primary plots, we get a check-in with Morgan and his son celebrating Christmas. Very timely for this video, I know. Nothing of real note happens, and for now, it's just a nice look into what they're up to. For the survivors though, they return to the prison to see it overrun by walkers, clearly making them think that they've been attacked. Though we would quickly learn that it had just been a mess up by the survivors themselves. They start clearing out the courtyard again, and for the most part, things calm down for a bit. That is, until Rick notices Martinez being gone. Straight away, he realizes that his apparent help was nothing more than an intel gathering mission, and he chases him down with the RV and puts him down, stopping him before he could get back to the governor. So yes, the entire mission to set free Rick and the others was all taught up by the governor. In the adaption, on the other hand, the governor retaliates straight away with an attack on the prison straight after they had left Woodbury. Put very briefly, both this, as well as everything else to follow, is a TV show exclusive. The whole Daryl and Merle leaving debacle is by default a live action thing, the return to Morgan, the meeting between Rick and the governor, Andrea being chased down by him, Michonne almost being traded in, all additions to the story, which we'll get into in a bit. But in the source material, following their return to the prison, everyone is on edge expecting an attack from Woodbury. thing is, it never happens. Even the survivors themselves say that someone stumbling around in the forest on foot would have found them by now, but still, nothing. And so we get something that I honestly don't really think we ever got in the adaptation of Season 3. The survivors just living. Glenn and Maggie get married, they have movie nights, basketball games, etc. This whole long period without an accident thing is moved to early Season 4, so more on this in later parts. They do also go on a few supply runs, most notably seeing a tank and joking around that it would be a great addition to their arsenal. This is of course foreshadowing it being used by the governor. They get everything they can and blow up the gas pump to stop the governor from using it and leave in a "we don't look at explosions" type of vibe. In the adaptation, following the attack by the old governor, Rick returns to his hometown in search of weapons, where we get the absolutely brilliant episode that is 312 Clear. This is still one of my favorite episodes in the entire series for sure. Seeing just how different things had gone for Morgan was fascinating, and their exchange was also just brilliant. Lenny James is a fantastic actor, and his whole monologue about putting his wife down but it being too late really is one of the most powerful moments in the franchise. So you can probably imagine what I think of his character in Fear the Walking Dead. We don't talk about that. Also, this is the episode where a fairly popular fan theory was born, as Morgan says that he's seen people wearing dead people's faces. In retrospect, these very much sound like the Whisperers, so many people are convinced that Morgan may have run into them before. And since it's safe to say that Kirkman was a little bit ahead in terms of the story, this could be a little Easter egg hidden in there. And again, that would have been an awesome plot line if he wasn't pushed to fear. Just saying. Also, obligatory Walking Dead soundtrack praise. It's in this episode that we get an absolute banger that is Lead Me Home by Jamie and Commons. You gotta listen to this one. Also, the death of Merle just before the finale, I legit think is one of the most underrated moments of the series. Just like with Laurie's death, Daryl crying was obviously memed to death, but I think Norman's performance was brilliant. And while I wouldn't call what Merle did redemption, he was still never really a good guy, it certainly showed us that he does love his brother and would do anything for him. If that doesn't humanize a character, then I don't know what will. Picking up the book, the ominous period of no retaliation from Woodbury continues and Laurie finally has to give birth. And by the way, if this whole timeline thing is a bit confusing between the two versions, just keep in mind that the comic usually doesn't skip the winter time. So by the time they got into the prison, Laurie was already at 9 months, while in the book, that takes place throughout all of these issues. With the help of Alice, the baby is delivered, and thus Judith is born. The only issue stemming from this whole thing is Dale having to go get gas for the generator and getting bitten. And this is where they once again attempt to chop off his leg to save him from the infection. And this time, it works. He later gets a prosthetic of sorts and is pretty much back on his feet. Again, this is pushed to season 4 with Herschel. Many more weeks pass and it really starts to seem like there will be no retaliation from the governor. Life just goes on and the prison is a real home for the group. One day, Alice asks the survivors to bring in a walker within the fences for research. At first, Rick opposes the idea but is convinced that it may prove valuable. After the baby has been born, Laurie and Rick had been spending a lot of their time caring for it. But with them getting used to the entire process again, Laurie was finally able to catch up with Carol. Remember what I brought up earlier in the video, the whole marriage with Rick and Laurie thing, and remember that she has been struggling ever since seeing Tyrese cheat on her. And so this day, she comes to Laurie and asks whether she would look after Sophia if anything happened to her. Laurie obviously says that she'd protect her as her own. A few days later, Carol walks out in the yard while the group is playing basketball and generally resting. She walks up to the walker, says that the group is judgmental and doesn't accept her for who she is, and walks straight into the hands of the strung-up walker. She is bit on the neck and is gone almost instantly. Just when things were starting to look up for the survivors, they find themselves holding another funeral. And as you'd expect, Sophia is absolutely devastated. They had already been spending a lot of their time together, but since she was now pretty much adopted by the Grimes family, Carl would be helping her get through this. And if you recall the whole Carol being lost in the tombs in the adaption, well, she was in fact supposed to die in Season 3, similar to the comic book version. But I think most people would agree that keeping her character around, considering where she would go, was a brilliant decision. But yes, originally she was never supposed to make it past the prison. And right on the heels of this, we get another instance of the old Kirk man slapping us in the face with a quite extreme juxtaposition. We have this frame of Dale being able to walk by himself with the makeshift prosthetic, Glenn and Maggie talking about having a kid, Tyrese playing basketball with Michonne, Rick and Herschel discussing how good the grown food is, and then suddenly, all of that is ripped away as they see half a dozen cars and a tank roll up to the prison. Just when they had let their guard down, the governor had struck. And here we have to take another step back for a moment and talk about how these attacks are handled in the two versions. As I mentioned before, the TV series took a different approach to this right from the get-go, as there was both the immediate retaliation as well as the whole meeting between the governor and Rick in 313. It feels like the war started as soon as Glenn was taken in episode 6, and this back and forth continues for the rest of the season. In the books, on the other hand, there's this long stretch of time where we don't see anything from the governor pretty much at all. But after this happens, we'd get a flashback to him explaining why they would allow their guards to lower and then strike. Speaking of which, let us return to the adaption, and I think this should illustrate my point. The season finale is here, which means we have an action piece on the cards. But unlike the books, where that was an uncertainty, the episode pretty much opens with the group getting ready for battle and fully expecting an imminent attack. Which is exactly what happens. They arrive with grenade launchers, heavy weaponry, and dozens of soldiers. We follow the entire attack as they breach the tombs and are surprised by a counterattack planned by the survivors. In the book, on the other hand, the tank is already present in the first attack, but the thing is, they go in without any real plan. The governor demands for the gates to be opened, which obviously does not happen, and the gunfight begins straight away. On top of that, most of the Woodbury forces have no clue what they're doing, so with just a few people firing back, most notably Andrea picking them off with a sniper rifle, they are sent retreating, and thus the first attack ends just as abruptly as it began. Contrary to the TV series, where this is not the first attack and is much more aggressive in both weaponry as well as tactics. The result, however, is very much the same. In both versions, the governor's forces fall back. And very quick side note, I have to once again bring up the soundtrack. The governor's theme for season 3, that being The Pulse, is simply brilliant. It's not really a song or anything, it's just background music, but I think the dark and almost disturbing tone of it perfectly encapsulates the governor as we know him, especially after the massacre of the season finale. The last few differences here is that 1, in the comics, Rick is shot during this attack and ends up needing a transfusion to save his life, and 2, the governor's story takes a very different turn in the TV adaptation. In a way, he does take an even more dark turn than in the books and shoots all of his own people in cold blood simply out of anger. He leaves them there and for now heads off to who knows where. None of this happens in the book. Following this, the squad tries going after the governor in a counterattack, but after seeing all of his forces shot to death, return to Woodbury and welcome in all the people there into the prison. This includes Tyrese, who had been sent away by Rick earlier in the season. Again, none of this happens in the book, and the only common detail is that in the comics, Michonne and Tyrese would try to go after the governor, but that's more in line with the season 4 events. And the very last thing to bring up is of course the death of Andrea. which I know to many is still seen as an absolute character assassination by the writers. As we talked about in the Season 2 video, in the books, she is always loyal to the group, unlike in the TV adaptation where she got together both with Shane and the governor. On top of that, even after knowing that the governor sent people to kill Michonne, the person who literally saved her life throughout the winter, she still tries to play both sides. After which, redeeming her is a bit difficult to say the least. Put briefly, that's why I always say that they are two different characters and only share a name between the two versions. So, to very quickly sum up the big differences. In the book, Carol is dead and Sophia is adopted by the Grimes family. Rick lost a hand when they were taken by the governor, but managed to escape. In the adaptation, Andrea dies after being bitten by Milton, and the rest of Woodbury joined the prison group, which is also the first time Tyrese and his sister Sasha, who doesn't exist in the book, properly joined them. But yes, that is Season 3. Do let me know what your perfect mix of the governor arc would be. Would Rick lose his hand? Is the governor more calculated as he is in the adaptation, or just a ruthless pirate as he is in the book? I'd ask about Andrea, but I don't think there's a single person who would say that she is a better character in the adaptation, but aside from that, any and all opinions are more than welcome. But with that, I'll see you back for Season 4, where we will finally wrap up the Governor arc. And that's the video. This one was a ton of fun to put together, as Season 3 is still a massive nostalgia trip for me. But my voice is completely gone. As usual, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons who allow me to produce even more of these chonkers for you all. Speaking of which, let's give a warm welcomes to our newest member, Jethawk. Seriously, thank you. And if you wish to join the highly coveted Mystery Shack Insiders Club, you can do so for as little as $1 per month and get access to all of the benefits. And last but not least, let us do the usual thing to see how many of you have stuck around until the very end. Leave a comment, whatever it may be, and include the words Salty Governor. Let's see what you come up with. Other than that, if you enjoyed the video, I'd really appreciate it if you clicked all the YouTube buttons to let the algorithm know. But now, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.